I'm Dr Karl, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. G'day, Dr Karl. Shirtloads of science to answer the big question, why are birds so weird? Where did they come from? So luckily, we have here Professor Simon Ho.
Thanks, Dr Karl, for having me.
You've helped tease out the origin of these strange creatures who don't have teeth, who've got a beak, and they've got these weird things called feathers, and sometimes they've got a little weird thing on the top of their head, and they've got scaly legs, and they're definitely not us.
No, they're not mammals, but they're our distant relatives. So anything with a skeleton is one of our relatives in a group called the vertebrates.
For a long time, I didn't know where they came from. And then I learned a half-truth, which was that, they're dinosaurs. That kind of got turned into all dinosaurs were birds, but no, that's not it. Now, this next bit is wrong. The big rock hit and whatever else happened to wipe out the non-bird dinosaurs. So am I right in saying that there were some dinosaurs that were birds before the big event 66 million years ago?
That's right. Birds have been around for a really long time, actually. So the oldest bird is Archaeopteryx. So many people will recognize that. It's that well-known fossil that has some lizard teeth. It's kind of like bent over backwards from Germany. Mm-hmm. And so it has some reptile features, but some bird features as well. And that's about 150 million years old.
150. So dinosaurs started off to 20 million years ago. Mostly died out 66. So when is this?
150 million years ago.
150 million. So, and you say they had teeth?
Yeah, so the early ones had a kind of mixture of features, some of the features that we see in birds today, but some of the ancestral features from reptiles.
The half-truth that I know, and please, this is what you're here for, Simon, to correct us. And by the way, you've had a fabulous paper in Nature called Complexity of Avian Evolution Revealed by Family-Level Genomics. And if you don't happen to be so much into the complicated genetic stuff, a lovely paper here in the conversation. After 10 years of work, landmark study reveals new tree of life for all birds, which is a lovely summary. My wrong knowledge, tell me how wrong it was, dinosaurs who were not birds all died out. The dinosaurs who were birds died out everywhere except in Australia, and about 55 million years ago started colonising the world. Where did the different groups of birds come from? I know none of that. So tell me how wrong I am.
You got bits of
it right.
Correct information, but kind of jumbled up there.
Thank you.
So we do have that oldest bird 150 million years ago.
Archaeopteryx.
That's right, but that's not one of the kind of modern birds.
Did Archaeopteryx have funny little fingers on the edge of some of the wings?
It had claws on its wings. It had some teeth. It had a long bony tail.
Yeah, a bony tail.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. It doesn't belong to one of the modern groups of birds, so it's not like one of the birds we see today. One of the big questions in bird evolution is how many different groups of birds or how many lineages of birds survived through that asteroid impact. So birds came from a particular group of dinosaurs called the theropods. That includes T-Rex.
You can say birds are dinosaurs? Is that a reasonable thing to say?
Birds are dinosaurs,
yeah,
yes.
Okay. So the birds, they were in that two-legged group.
Theropods, that's right. And they're generally the carnivorous ones with the famous T-Rex.
Yep.
So,
except for stupid Hawatson, but we'll worry about him later.
Well, according to our study, at least 3 lineages of birds survived through that extinction event.
3 lineages survived through that. So it's not like one survived and broke into different lineages, but 3 separate lineages survived?
3 separate lineages, that's right, yep.
Right.
The Paleognathes, and that's a group that includes birds called the ratites, which are the flightless big birds like the ostrich and the emu and the cassowary.
Mm-hmm. And they're less than 5% of all modern birds.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, and then there's?
Then there's the fowl. So the land fowl and waterfowl. That's the ducks, geese, chickens, turkeys, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Less than 5%?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
And then we have another third lineage that is all other birds. So that gave rise to all of the other birds that we see today. That's the 95% of all living bird species.
Okay, so the 3 lineages made it through that choke point, that bottleneck 66 million years ago. Somewhere you were proposing a 4th group?
That broke up into 4 major groups. There's a lot of these nested subgroups within groups of birds, and that's why it's a little bit complicated, but it's really the relationships in this big third group that have really been uncertain over the years.
Is that the 7 plus 3?
That's right.
And what's the 7 and what's the 3? And I seem to remember the word orphan in there somewhere.
Yeah, so there's these 10 groups of birds in that
group, which is 95% of today's birds.
Yep, basically all of the studies so far have had a lot of trouble trying to work out how those 10 groups are related to each other. So there's 7 called the Magnificent 7.
The Magnificent 7? That's a bit humble, isn't it?
Well, they've been around for a while, so we've known that there are those 7 groups. A few studies have shown that there are those 7 groups of birds. And then there's 3 groups that are really hard to place in this bird family tree, and they're called the orphaned lineages. They're the orphans.
I remember reading somewhere, and once again, please tell me if I'm wrong because you're the expert and I'm not, the weight of chickens is greater than the weight of all the other species of birds put together, but they're in that second group less than 5%. So that's not 5% of total numbers, that's 5% of species?
Of species, that's right.
Oh, is that what it is? Is that still true, that it's the weight of chicken is greater than the weight of all the other birds put together?
Yeah, I believe it is. And that's similar to a lot of the other domesticated animals where we've just been responsible for this huge increase in their numbers.
I was reading one article that said if somebody in the future came from another planet and then started going through our garbage dumps, they'd think this was the age of the chicken because there's so many chicken bones there.
And we found that these 10 groups of birds fall into 4 big groups.
I think you wrote, was this the article in New Yorker called The Bizarre Bird That's Breaking the Tree of Life? There was something about how Charles Darwin had only one diagram in his book Origin of the Species, which was an evolutionary tree, based on the birds in the Galapagos Islands. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so these family trees or evolutionary trees really form the basis of a lot of our biology now because it tells us how different species are related to each other. And the first diagram was in one of Charles Darwin's notebooks. It was a sketch in his notebooks based on the finches. That was in the 1830s. And then in the Origin of Species, there was only one diagram, one figure in that book, and that was an evolutionary tree.
So we've got this evolutionary tree, but then how do you make it? Obviously now we can look at the DNA, but back then they'd look at things like, does it hunt on land or water? Is it a daytime hunter or a nighttime hunter? How effective is that a way of grouping correctly, we think, different species?
Yeah, so for a long time that was the way, looking at their physical characteristics. So you can even look at their skeletons to work out how fossils are related to each other. So does this bone have this knob or doesn't it have that knob? Does it stick out that way? What's the angle? What's the size? Back then it was all just based on their physical appearance, physical traits. And now it's mostly DNA based, a combination of DNA and these physical traits. But DNA just gives us a lot more information just because the genomes have so much information in them.
I was surprised to read back in 2001 it was found that the closest relative of the flamingo, which is significantly different from its relative, the grebe. What is a grebe and how is it different from a flamingo?
That's another water bird, but it does look quite different from a flamingo. So we do see in the bird family tree that there are lots of these birds that really don't look very alike. And a lot of these surprising findings come from studies of the DNA, but not of their physical traits.
How do you go into the DNA? What do you look at?
Yeah, so DNA is in our genomes. So our genomes are like an instruction book on how to make us. And the human genome has 3 billion letters. And what happens is that this instruction book is copied each time we have the next generation. But when that copying happens, mistakes are made. And so the children at each generation are slightly different because they build up these mutations.
So one of the great discoveries of the 20th century, that out of these 3 billion rungs in the ladder of life, so it looks like a ladder, but with 3 billion rungs, and our cells have got 2 meters of it, which is a lot of stuff into one cell, that any 3 rungs, not any 3, but a group of 3 rungs are the instructions for the machinery inside the cell, the biological machinery, to assemble or grab an amino acid. And then you put a bunch of amino acids together, you get a protein. And
the genomes contain these things called genes, which you're describing, and they're the ones that make the proteins that in our bodies. Yeah.
So how do you look at the DNA to say the flamingo with its long legs, now am I right in saying that the grebe has got tiny little legs?
Yeah, it certainly looks very different from a flamingo.
Yeah.
And so with the DNA, we can look at, so if birds are more closely related to each other, their DNA is going to be more similar because they haven't picked up as many mutations over time to separate them. So it's kind of like looking at a family tree. When we look at our siblings, our DNA is most similar to them. But if we're looking at our cousins, our DNA is more different from theirs.
How do you pick the difference between one creature's DNA and the next? Is it like having a set of playing cards and you know what it's supposed to be, and then another set of playing cards come along and they're arranged differently, or they've got different cards?
No, you basically look at the string of letters. So birds, their genomes are smaller than ours. They have 1 billion letters.
Okay, they got 1 billion, we've got 3 billion.
So if you line up those 1 billion letters from one bird and then line up the billion from another bird, then you can see which letters are different between the two.
Then how do you look at 1 billion letters in less than a human lifetime? There's only 1 million hours in a human lifetime of 120 years. That's a lot of looking.
Well, we definitely don't do that by hand. It's all done by computers these days, and usually supercomputers. Some of these analyses of this DNA data can take months on a computer.
You're finding then that the birds that have got similar long regions or similar regions, you tend to group them together?
If they don't have as many differences in their DNA, then they're probably closer relatives. And so that's how we can use that information to construct the whole tree of all of these birds.
Now, I was reading in your paper the intergenic regions. Can you explain what a gene is, and then what a gene region is, and then what a non-gene region is?
So the genome has lots of different bits of DNA in it. So some of those bits of DNA make the proteins in our bodies, but there's a lot of it, more than 90%, that doesn't make the proteins, and a lot of it doesn't really have any known function. So they're the kind of DNA that are between genes. So that's intergenic between genes.
Let me just come back to that. You're saying most of the DNA does stuff that we don't know what it does.
Yeah, we don't know what it does, and a lot of it's repetitive as well. So it doesn't look like it has a lot of information in it, but there's a lot of junk in our genomes, it seems.
How do we know it's junk?
We don't know for sure, and in fact, a lot of research has shown that these bits of DNA might have some sort of function. So we're finding more about our genome over time. The function's not that obvious.
I'm just kind of thinking of a gorilla wandering into a house and seeing a violin and thinking, oh, that's just a bit of junk, not knowing its full potential.
Probably going to take a lot more research to work out what these non-gene parts of the genome are really doing.
In humans, what percentage roughly is genes? And in birds, what percentage roughly is genes?
In humans, it's about 1%, so it's a very small percentage.
What?
And I'd imagine it'd be pretty similar in birds, maybe slightly more, because I think they have similar numbers of genes.
The overwhelming majority of our DNA does stuff that we don't know what it does?
That's right, probably more than 90%.
Has this been covered up by big DNA or big gene or big biology?
Well, it might be the case. I mean, there are lots of organisms that have much bigger genomes than us, so who knows what their DNA is doing, what their genomes are doing.
Roughly how many genes are there? A gene being something that makes proteins, like there would be in, say, humans and birds?
Probably about 20,000.
Ballpark.
A few tens of thousands, yeah.
In humans and in birds?
Probably about a similar number, yeah.
Okay. And then there's the vast majority of over 90% of stuff, which is the intergenic region that you talk about.
Yeah, so intergenic just means anything that's between genes or outside genes. So that's pretty much the rest of the genome.
Wouldn't you want to actually look at the genes? So if you're looking at the bits of the DNA that make the bird, you'd want to look at the bits that make this bird different from that bird. But you're saying you're looking at the bits of the DNA that are different?
So when we're trying to look at the relationships among birds, the genes are actually a bit of a problem because genes are under natural selection, which means that when you have a mutation in a gene, it can mess up the proteins that the genome is trying to make. So it can actually harm the bird. And that means that over time, those mutations disappear because of natural selection. Natural selection removes those. So when we're looking at the bits of the genome that aren't the genes, they're not under as strong natural selection. And so they preserve a lot of the signal of their evolutionary past.
The way you spoke there, I'm assuming that you disagree with 40% of the American population who reckon that there is no such thing as evolution.
That would be correct.
Okay, so why are you looking at the non-gene part?
You can look at the genes as well to study evolutionary relationships, but it turns out in birds that the genes are misleading. So previous work on bird relationships studied the genes, and it seems like the genes show a different set of relationships, and it seems like that was misleading a lot of previous studies. And it turns out that the bits between the genes are probably more accurate in terms of the relationships that they support.
And they're the bits that are similar in the long-legged flamingo and the short-legged grebe, which I'd never heard of before.
Yeah, so when you compare the bits of the genome that aren't in the genes, then it turns out that the flamingo and the grebes are close relatives.
Is it true that the birds all end up clustered in Australia after the big rock and the 66 million year ago event?
Not all birds. We don't know where the ancestor of all birds lived, but in Australia, there's a big group of birds called the passerines, which are the perching birds. That's a lot of the birds that we see every day, like magpie and honeyeaters and so on.
Perching, does that mean that they've got feet that grab around a branch automatically?
That's right. In Australia, when you look up at a tree and you see some birds, they're probably passerines or parrots.
Are parrots perching birds as well?
No, parrots are close relatives of perching birds, but perching birds include a big group called songbirds, and these are about half of all birds. So there's nearly 11,000 species of bird in the world.
Yep.
Perching birds are about 60% of all birds, and songbirds are nearly half of all bird species. And it seems like they originated in Australia.
Are there other species that we found in old fossils soon after that big rock in other parts of the world?
Some of the oldest fossils are things like penguins and other water birds, because I guess they live in environments where they're more likely to become fossils. Mm-hmm. But in Australia, we see the oldest songbirds, and it seems like these songbirds arose in Australia about 50 million years ago.
So I was totally wrong when I said all the birds were in Australia till 30 million years ago, and then they colonised the world. So firstly, the time period was wrong. And then secondly, there were birds, but you're saying in lesser numbers of species in other parts of the world?
The most diverse group of birds, the songbirds, did originate in Australia. So Australia was the home of a lot of the world's bird diversity. Not quite all birds, but a very large portion of those birds.
How did evolution take off after the big rocks?
When the asteroid hit the Earth, it wiped out dinosaurs and some other organisms, and it would have given a lot of opportunities for birds to take over. So when you go into a forest and the dinosaurs are gone, then if you're a bird, you make the most of that opportunity. Over time, birds just kind of filled all these different niches in all these different habitats across the world.
Because 40 million years ago, we had India slam into Asia via tectonic plate activity and push up the Himalayas, and that started to drop the carbon dioxide level down and begin to cool the world a bit.
Yeah, so there have been a few changes in temperature and also changes in where the continents were.
How would you say summarise the work you've done in kind of different view of the bird world it gives us today from what we had from the past?
Yeah, so I think this study really provides the best estimate of the family tree of birds so far. So we think we have the best idea of how birds are related to each other, better than previous work, because we've used the largest amount of genomes and some pretty complex models to analyse them. That provides foundation for studying their evolution.
According to that New Yorker article, way back there were a study that looked at 48 species of birds, and you said how many? There's over 11,000?
Nearly 11,000, yeah.
48 is a small sample size, and the next one looked at 198. How many species did you look at?
363.
363, but you're still not up to 3,000.
Well, that's actually the hardest part. So in this sort of research, the hardest bit is actually getting the birds themselves, getting those specimens. So they come from museums, they're sometimes caught, but that's the hardest bit, because getting their genomes and analysing them is actually the easy part.
Is it true that the birds have got a different way of wiring up their brains? Like I keep on reading articles about such birds as the magpie and the crows, both simultaneously very small brains, but very efficiently and very super smart brains.
In a few different parts of the bird family tree, we see this intelligence appearing. So some of them can use tools and some of them can learn through like vocal learning. But it seems like it happens several times in the bird family tree. Different types of bird can use tools, and it's not clear how they learn these things to begin with.
So I did a podcast with Giselle Kaplan at one stage, and she was telling me how she came home one day to see a magpie on her desk. She was raising some, and it was near her computer, and it was one at a time pressing the keys on the keyboard with the beak and seeing what appeared on the screen. I was trying to work out the relationship between the keyboard and what appeared on the screen.
Yeah, now we see cockatoos opening up bins to get at food.
and I was seeing something about a dog and a magpie raised together, and so to keep the family relationship and the friendliness going, the magpie learnt how to bark like a dog.
Yeah, and then they were separated and now reunited, I think.
It seems like we're learning a lot more, and that your work has given us a significant push forward in understanding birds.
Yeah, so it looks like the bird family tree is kind of now known with some confidence. There's still one bird that's really elusive, this bird that you referred to earlier called the hoatzin.
Did I have the right pronunciation? Is that
hoatzin? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I did a story on that way back in the 1980s about how it was called the cowbird because it smelled like a cow.
It can ferment food in its gut, so it smells like manure.
What?
It doesn't smell so good. Yeah, it's the only bird that can do that.
It ferments?
It has a lot of really unusual features, this bird. It has like a kind of punk rock mohawk,
Yeah.
red eyes, and when it's young, it has these claws on its hands that can help it climb trees.
When it's young, it has claws, and
So
they lose them.
So they do look a
Wow.
bit. They do look a bit like that old Archaeopteryx bird in the fossil record, but they actually got these claws not from their ancestors, but they kind of evolved them separately.
But isn't it the fact that the bird flies and a simple gut is much lighter than a gut where you've got fermentation going on and you have to carry around bacteria with you and all that sort of stuff?
Some birds are more than 10 kilograms. Most birds can fly, but some of them have lost that ability.
So where does hoatzin sit in this tiny less than 5%, and then 95%?
Yeah, so it's in the big group, but
Really?
exactly where it goes, it hasn't been clear just because they look so different, and they're also the only survivor in their whole lineage. So they don't share an ancestor with birds unless we look tens of millions of years in the past. It looks like they group with the other orphans. So it's one of the orphans, and it seems like it groups with shorebirds and cranes.
Can you tell me what the 7+3 groups are?
Well, the Magnificent Seven.
Yep, the Magnificent Seven.
They include flamingos, pigeons, cuckoos, hummingbirds.
So that's 4 groups we've gone through now.
And then the 5th one, tropic birds.
Tropic birds? You mean all the birds that live between plus and minus 10 degrees from the equator?
No, these are actually just the names of the birds themselves with a few other relatives.
Yeah.
And then we have water birds and land birds. So that's the 7.
Where did chickens come from?
And so, a lot of these animals were domesticated around 10 to 20,000 years ago, along with a lot of our agricultural crops.
And how come chickens got to be so plentiful in numbers?
Oh, I guess it depends on their tastes and whether they're easy to rear, whether they're willing to hang around humans. And we bred them to become plump and juicy.
How can people follow you in your fine work on electronic media? But also, how can they ring you up and say, I want to be a student?
Well, our research can be found at our website, which is meep.sydney.edu.au.
So what was that first thing?
MEEP.
Some famous bird that makes a sound.
That's right,
meep?
the roadrunner.
But what does MEEP really stand for?
It actually stands for the research that we do. So it's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's molecular ecology, evolution, and phylogenetics.
And were you very happy when you managed to make that sound like the roadrunner bird?
It's always good to make an abbreviation that sounds like a sound effect as well. Yeah.
So meep.sydney.edu.au. Okay, so they can follow you there. Professor Simon Ho, thank you so much for fixing up the mistakes that I had in my mind about birds and for setting me straight. Thank you so much for coming on to help us.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dr. Karl.
Shirtloads of Science is washed, spun and aired by the University of Sydney.